Hey, Jarrod, how are you?
Great. How are you doing, Mike?
Very good. Well, thanks so much for taking this time to talk a little bit about the future of media in relation to Web3. We've got a couple topics to discuss, particularly around the current state of media, kind of Web2 business models that Web3 can change, talking a little bit about some business fundamentals and kind of 10 key elements in an investor pitch. I think something you and I know a little bit about, kind of given our backgrounds, but why don't you kick us off and talk a little bit about both your background, where you're currently at, your involvement in Web3, and then I'll jump in and then we can dive into those topics directly.
Yeah. So it's awesome to be here. I'm excited to chat with Mike, who's a dear friend, and to speak to everyone in the community. So as Mike mentioned, I'm currently at the Washington Post. I oversee all of our commercial efforts here, from development to technology to strategy. And I also oversee our R&D group, our research, experimentation, and development group that is it's very unique and interesting to the media space because it's heavily integrated. So in more traditional media environments and even in tech environments, R&D is usually off to the side. There's a certain budget, there's experiments, hopefully one or two take off, but there's no expectations other than just kind of testing and experimenting, where we've kind of built a culture here that integrates that really enables every single person who's within the organization to feel like they're building something right at the inception of an idea, and then give them the tools that they need in order to kind of cultivate that and build it into an actual product, technology or business. Prior, I was the CEO of Poet, and still on the advisory of Poet, which was a decentralized protocol for the media economy, and still is. And what kind of drove me to that, and still kind of drives my interest in Web3 and things that I'm working on here and with other partners, as well, is really kind of this idea of how to open up creators, in the media space, like really trying to focus on key pillars that have kind of defined the struggling artist, and really kind of getting that adjective away from people who are creating and bringing so much value, and actually kind of giving them worth, whether that's financial worth or credibility or ownership of kind of what they're doing. And what really attracted me to things like Poet and companies like Civil within the Consensys network is kind of this opportunity that really kind of frees people from feeling like they need to be over-reliant on current processes. I think that there's a lot of obvious statements that could be made about how advertising drives the media economy and how that's bad, and how that's bad for creators. There's subscription fatigue, and there's only so many things that a consumer could subscribe to, so our creators missing out. There's things like rights management, where you create something and it's out on the web, and they make it so easy, they being the internet, makes it so easy to steal that oftentimes you don't even know that you're stealing. An example I always give is, you search for an image in Google, you on iOS, you hover over that image, you could save it directly to your camera roll. You're not necessarily doing it to be malicious, but that doesn't carry through any metadata, that doesn't carry through the ownership. So all of a sudden that image is now out in the open and free to use. And the mechanics, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, even two and a half years ago, when I first started thinking about how, blockchain and decentralization in general could be tied to media, how that's kind of cultivated is still along those lines, which I think is an amazing thing, right? I think when phenomena happen and you think about certain applications, there's things that work and there's things that don't work, and the things that don't work, you really move on from. And I think what you've seen with a lot of the blockchain projects, especially in the media space, is that they're really sticking to the conventions and the reasons why they started in the first place. And words like trust and transparency, whether that's coming from an advertising chain, or, that's coming, again, tying to rights issues, or being able to enable people to be more independent and have more ownership of the work that they're doing, are still kind of the core focuses of a lot of these projects. So quickly, or just more background, prior to Poet, I was at the Washington Post, where I incubated and started the R&D group. Prior to that, I was at the Huffington Post, where I led all commercial technology. So have always been deeply fascinated by media. leaning on the commercial side because I actually find that there was a lot more opportunity to experiment and innovate when you're driving value and revenue for the company. They kind of let you go and do what you want to do and kind of opens up the opportunity to solve real problems that now more than ever really plaguing the media industry, which is sustainability, right, and support. So that's kind of always been my passion, and blending the two is something that I care deeply about and continue to care deeply about. And, you know, am so excited by all of the projects that are coming out of the Web3 group, especially as it pertains to this, that, you know, I have ideas of my own that I can't wait to either build on my own or work with partners in order to kind of bring these to fruition. So that's a quick way of background.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's so amazing to see, and I think this is great. Consensys, as it continues to lead hackathons and to think about questions on the ways in which media can evolve and change. Very excited to hear what the individual developers come up with. I think, you know, one of the things that you said about sustainability was ultimately what drove me into working at Consensys and being a part of this Web3 movement. Prior to joining Consensys, which I should say, by the way, that I lead up the media and advertising vertical. What that means simply is that any and all activities that exist within Consensys in relation to that specific vertical, I try to help out with, I try to create and develop. In some instances, there are platforms that have their own companies and CEOs like Civil and Udo that are seeking to develop those at a very, very high level. But then on the Web3 core infrastructure, when we're discussing that base protocol layer, how can the advertising industry, specifically around ad tech, utilize and actually build upon Ethereum? So that's the breadth and depth there, in addition to working with companies that Consensys might invest in or might fund, whether through a hackathon or more. Prior to Consensys, I was at Mashable, where I was the chief operating officer there. And certainly, I think hearing you talk about that, sustainability was ultimately what drove me into Web3, because these business models that you discuss, something I think we're about to get into to chat about, is that independent media companies are not sustainable. We can debate that and talk about that because, and what I'd love to maybe go through is three topics. One, in relation to intermediaries and how Web3 can remove intermediaries. Two, you touched upon this in relation to the rights management and how we can build and value to creators. And then three, pretty much the holy grail, which is identity. And this notion of a two-way street, the ways in which individual users, when they permission their data, how they can actually get value for that, and how by giving and getting and giving value that's associated with those individuals and those users will actually move them closer down the marketing funnel, which is ultimately the reason why many advertising-based models exist. So there has to be that two-way street. I will touch upon, prior to Mashable, I worked for several independent media companies prior to that, Haymarket Media, and started my career at Anderson, where I was auditing and advising those first wave of internet companies back in the day. So let's go through some of those, the current state of the media and how these business models can be changed through Web3. So certainly on the rights management side, why don't we kick it off? And Jarrod, give us your thoughts a little bit about some of the products, some of the solutions that are out there, and what do you think actually needs to advance on that front?
Yeah. So rights, I mean, it's very loaded. And I think that the internet has kind of really expedited the urgency, right, to try to figure these problems out, where before you used to need certain platforms or permissions to put something out there, whether that's music or an article or any sort of creative outlet, whereas now those platforms are available to you on an individual level for you to be able to kind of express what you want and put whatever you want out there. Now, mind you, the issue with that, right, is that each one of these platforms have different rules and rights and regulations for that individual creator about how things are being used. An example that I always like to give and think about is with Twitter. So many creators are on Twitter. They have there's so much original content and IP on Twitter. It's changed the way that you actually communicate and and write a story, and distribute a photo, or like how the paparazzi and all these things work. However, there's really no mechanism in there for people who tweet to make money. And mind you, that's like because that's how Twitter wanted to construct, and they want to be able to have it open and be out there. But you think about someone who has 100,000 followers, who may be a photographer, whose tweets get continuously retweeted and faved. If they had the opportunity to set certain limits, or a contract through Ethereum on that certain photo, then they can start making money and bringing value to that platform directly. So where I think rights has become a critical topic of conversation is that there isn't necessarily a standard for rights. There attempts to be multiple standards for rights, especially when it comes to the Web3 movement, but not every company needs to abide by it, and not every company financially benefits from executing on those certain rights. So while the internet has allowed us to identify and build communities around creators and have people flourish, and I think that it has been extremely beneficial. I think that it is a good thing what you see people do with Instagram and YouTube, and even on the brand side, what direct-to-consumer businesses are able to do, where you don't need a storefront, you just need an Instagram ad to build a business. There's a ton of value kind of with how that goes, but when it comes to being able to own that IP and monitor that and kind of see how it's being used or misused, that's not necessarily something that's open and accessible. So you kind of seen some sort of attempts on doing that. You've seen like Patreon and other sorts of services that aren't necessarily just platforms paying you for your work, but actually giving you some opportunity to charge what you want and open what you want. Substack is, probably the most popular one right now on email. But a standard for that, I think, is more interesting. And I think what you've seen now, right, if we're talking about the recent conversations around, right, it's a great time to be on blockchain, right? Because the recent conversations around privacy and the platforms, right, and kind of how things are being shared. I don't necessarily believe that creators feel that they want these platforms the way that they used to feel that. They used to feel that their communities are there, and that's how they build a following, and that's, they need to create content for where that community is. But I think now more so because of everything that's happening in this space, if there were new opportunities for creators to go elsewhere, or maybe have less an audience but have more value to their work, I think that dynamic is extremely interesting. And so like that's where I kind of think it really hits the nail on the head. I mean, a direct value for rights that I think of, you think of the old news services, you think of the AP and Reuters and how they deliver content and how you monitor how that content is used. And on the back end, and this is getting more kind of in the weeds of how the media business works, but there's a lot of kind of rights in circulation of how content goes out there. And once that content is out there, they're basically licensed to use it how they will. So let's say the AP gives an article to the New York Times to use on the homepage. The New York Times isn't necessarily required to feed back all of that data to the AP. So that article could go viral. They could sell a ton of direct dramatic against that article, and the AP will never know that. Now, mind you, that's the way, again, that the current structure is. But when you start to be able to monitor, right, downstream what's actually happening on certain pieces of content or certain pieces of creative, then things really start to open up. And I know you and I have spoken about this a lot when it comes to the ad tech side, right? Really being able to see where creative is going, who's paying for what, those people who are paying, what are they being charged for? And really kind of using rights in the sense of transparency to be able to see exactly kind of what's going on and what that value is bringing. And that, to this day, even now more so, where a lot of my Web3 work and blockchain work is I mean, it's a little bit at the post, but a lot of it is more so a hobby. And outside of the post, I still think that blockchain is the best solution for a lot of those functionalities, because the idea that it's open and and governed by consensus. Because without that, there's a ton of kind of back and forth, and you lose trust, right? And not necessarily knowing that what you're seeing is actually what you should be seeing. The other side of it, which is something that I've always been obsessed with and still am obsessed with, is this idea of like expose the same way that you could expose information when it comes to rights and being able to follow things down the chain or through the entire supply chain is the same way that I think information and fake news and, the conversations around that, it's the same sort of like fundamental dynamics that I think bring that value as well. So when I read an article, how do I know that article is actually from CNN? How do I know that the person in the video is Barack Obama and not Jordan Peele, right? Like you've seen the deep fakes, and like that's a real problem that's happening today, that something like a decentralized exposure of data that allows you to kind of follow the whole entire trail down that isn't necessarily managed by a single body or a single person really kind of opens up ways that we start to trust and read and communicate. So I think like the idea of rights is specific, but I think that the functions of how rights works, especially in Web3, like open up tons of opportunities for, I know we're talking to like companies that are built or people that are building companies, a ton of opportunities when it comes to like how media should be consumed, what media could be trusted, how it is exposed, and how you pay for it, and from the massive level of a Washington Post to the individual level of a Jarrod Dicker blogging or writing something on SoundCloud.
Yeah, I think I agree. So from a developer perspective, we've got individuals then that really have an open field to be able to create platforms like you've said, right? If there's a new platform that says that creators will get paid more than what they presently do, that there's an opportunity to have those creators move to that new platform. We saw that with PewDiePie and others, that you have this potential simply by providing transparency and a greater slice. I think certainly with VidCon coming up next week, there's going to be a lot of conversation around that as well. By the same token, as you say, working within the existing standards with large organizations, and we've seen this within ad tech, if you're able to create a very small, specific product with that expertise and that understanding within advertising, then you may be able to incorporate from within, whether it's with ad agencies that have R&D budgets to be able to help fund and develop. And that's something that ad tech is very used to. They're very used to being able to learn about new tech. They view this simply as new, better tech, which is great. There's not some mystifying, magical approach that blockchain solutions bring, but rather they view these as that opportunity to do what they do, which is hold on to their clients. So would definitely encourage developers to think about that deep understanding on how the problems. But you're correct in the sense that it's across the board. It's a question of synthesizing the transparency that's needed from a content creator's perspective to those who support it on the ad side.
Yeah, and from a developer and product perspective, what I'd also say is that I think it's very easy when you're building something to look at use cases today and how there's solutions. And what I would encourage, especially building in this space, is like identify the problems that you think you're building a solution for, because a lot of the times the problems like shouldn't exist in the first place, and you could actually start disrupting there. So that's kind of like, I hate more than anything when people are like, blockchain is, what a solution, or I forgot what they used to say. They don't say it as much anymore, but like that there's like no problem to solve and that everything is being force fitted. And I think like when you think of it in that way, sure, like, right, like, can I send a message with a fax machine and not through email? Absolutely. But do I want to do that? No. And I think like that's because you start to focus on what you're solving for in the first place and try to start to infect that problem, and building products for that become extremely interesting. So when you talk about the agencies, I think it's easy to be like, okay, right now we're losing money and there's a lot of like transparency concerns and we don't know where that money is flowing through the chain, and we want to be able to know where our money is being spent and where our creative is going, and blockchain helps expose that, sure. But then taking a step back, is the way that they're buying in the first place even like as optimal as it could be? And could the way that blockchain offers a solution also infect the way that they're actually doing this in the first place and create the whole value chain? I mean, I think like that's what's most exciting about this space, is that there shouldn't be a reliance on how things currently are, because I think if you're really looking to infect this change, then it won't just be on one end or the other. You're actually going to end up creating a whole entirely new process. It'll start somewhere, but because of that, then you'll have to kind of figure out the beginning, the middle, and the end, and you'll flow through that. And that's where, again, kind of the whole idea around what Web3 is and what it brings is completely different than anything accessible today. So we'd be foolish to think that we're going to solve one part of the problem, but the other part of the problem will stay the same. It's just this is going to come first and this will come after. And I think more and more you'll see brands, creators, publishers, anyone start to realize that, especially as their business is being like deeply affected by, the old web model and, trying to think about how the new web model brings them forward.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about creating a more efficient marketplace, because on one side, we have content and that's the supply side that we've touched upon on rights management and how that can be affected. Talked a little bit about advertisers and providing that transparency within the ad tech realm. The third piece to that puzzle is obviously users, people that consume content and consume ads. Maybe you can touch a little bit on identity and where you think that that's heading, because I think if we give direction to developers, there are individual solutions for all three of those individuals within the marketplace.
Yeah. So I would say, I think identity is, again, we talked about this. I think identity is one of the most exciting things that's happening in the Web3 space. Again, going back to not just thinking about how, these products could solve problems today, but this is actually, identity is something that's actually rethinking how the whole entire ecosystem works and how it could affect that from the get-go in order to kind of lay down the chain of command. A direct example of a trend that I'm seeing today that I think isn't necessarily going to continue because I don't think that it's sustainable is this idea of bundles. There's a lot that I'm rooting for, and there's many that are interesting, like going as large as Netflix, right, to kind of going through the cable networks, but even like what Tony Hale and Scroll are doing. And I think that those are extremely exciting things. But when you talk about identity, I think what happens there is you could turn it on its head and really start to think differently about how those ecosystems work, right? So if we know that people only have so much money to become a member of something or to subscribe to something, are we benefiting the consumers? Are we benefiting the creators, right? Like, does someone lose in the end? Like, how do we build an ecosystem for all? And I think the bundles have a huge place there. And I think ones like Scroll will continue to have a huge place there because they're bringing a lot of things together and hitting on major things. But I think there's another side of it, which is giving that individual an agency to be able to kind of move around the web as they see fit, to kind of engage with things that they find interesting. And again, going back to an old example, like I remember my father spending $250 on a cable bill every single month, and he only watched one channel, and he couldn't remove channels, right? Because if you remove channels, then it would just barely cut the cost, and then to the point where it's either you're going to have cable or not get cable. And those are still kind of the mechanics that are happening in many of these bundles today. Now, me as a user, if I have data that is of value, right, that an advertiser would want to pay for or want to target me, or someone may want to follow me, right? Or there's some value exchange of me as an individual. How do I start leveraging that as a currency, right? And where identity is so powerful, especially thinking about it in that way, where you as an individual have data and that is a currency for you to tour across the web, is I think that it'll force a change that we all as consumers have been waiting for. You'll never, it'll take a long time, and you've seen Apple try to do this, right? Where you're trying to bring together competing magazines and competing news brands and everyone into kind of one space so that the consumer could go to one place and get all of their content. However, all of these different publishers and companies have their own business models and have not only their own business models, they oftentimes have very diversified business models that are different than one another. So bundling their value into one conglomerate isn't necessarily the best thing for their business. However, as a user, that is the best sort of experience. So when you think about identity and how that user could kind of leverage that data as a currency, does that start to force the way that consumption happens across the web, where there will be certain publishers or video companies or anyone who's delivering some sort of creative that kind of open themselves up to be able to allow an individual to come in and not necessarily be monetized via ads or be monetized via a membership or subscription bundle, either directly with the site itself or through through more an aggregate, but actually in a one-on-one sort of exchange. And I think that that's actually something that's extremely interesting. So Julian Geneso, who's a developer, built Unlock Protocol. And Unlock Protocol is on Web3, and that's an example leveraging Ethereum, where publishers or any creators could put JavaScript on their site. And then if someone comes in via their MetaMask wallet or any other wallet, they could come and unlock an article directly without having to be a member, and so forth. And I think that both sides, right, the big bundle side, but also that individual side, are both like very valuable utilities that will continue to kind of grow this model. But that, to me, when it comes to identity, is a huge thing, because I think each of us as individuals have the same amount of, have one thing that we all share, which is the amount of time we have, right? Attention is like our ultimate currency. We all have 24 hours in a day, and how we choose to spend it, or, you know, where we choose to go or who we choose to see is all up to us. It's very similar when it comes to like tying that sort of stuff to your identity and your value, right? My time on a site, or where I'm deciding to go, or who I decide to engage with, should have some sort of nominal value that is tied to me as an individual. So again, like that's something, to go full circle, that I think is the most interesting and most exciting, because I think it's being iterated and experimented on, but I think we're only in like the early infancy of what this could actually do, because I don't necessarily just think it's like an application or way to kind of go through the web a certain way. I think it's actually going to change and dictate the way that we think about even the newest models, right? Like things like bundles and integrations and partnerships are things that are supposed to be, you know, further pushing the media industry forward. And I think, especially when you're in this sort of world and looking at everything that's happening, you could be like, oh man, we're way beyond that, right? We need to start thinking about this world and kind of making these associations when it comes to individual direct. So yeah, I mean, in general, I think that that's like kind of like an area to really hit oil that's going to open up just the way that we think about everything, whether that's from, you know, the way that we consume to the way that we exchange to the way that we make money, you know, tied to a very individual level of how you choose to spend your time or engage.
Yeah, that's great. So to summarize, there are really three unique approaches here within media and advertising. Talking about identity and value of time and being able to engage, rights management in relation to content, and transparency within advertising, specifically within ad tech. And I think those are three really specific examples of how Web3 can change and benefit the media and advertising space. So let's briefly switch gears here and talk a little bit about these developers, and a little bit about the fact that both you and I working and leading startups, that there are really two sides to the equation. One is coming up with a really great idea. We talked a little bit about addressing problems and finding the right solutions for that, but also equally important, you're still running a business. You still have to be able to develop a business plan, be able to pitch to investors, because once you come up with that idea and you get it, then what's next? And so we'd like to use maybe the next 10 minutes or so to talk a little bit about what that is and what that exists. So a little bit about perhaps the business plan fundamentals. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you think needs to be in a business plan. In other words, I've got this great idea. What's next? How do I get, and what do I need before I get into pitching investors?
Yeah. So I believe that that storytelling is the strongest quality for basically anyone looking to build anything. When you think about in a larger organization, bringing ideas to life, because I like to equate the ideas of entrepreneurship with entrepreneurship as well. I think it's definitely way harder to start something from scratch on your own and raise money for than it is to kind of incubate something within a larger company. However, there are still certain mechanisms that need to kind of be put into place and certain strategies done in order to kind of get ideas accepted and to kind of show value that helps you take something from just like a nugget of an idea to something larger that gets more buy-in. And that's kind of really tied to storytelling. What I always recommend is how can you kind of paint a picture to what you're building, but also where you're going, and how does that tie to, you know, real world value? I think a lot of entrepreneurs, struggle there, because I think it's very easy to identify something that's missing and fill a gap. To be able to say, okay, look, like we we don't have flying scooters, so let's build flying scooters, right? Rather than saying, well, why 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 don't we have them, and also like what value would that bring, and then kind of being able to tell a narrative and kind of build that in order to kind of show the strength of what you're looking to do. So like the first thing that I always say, especially when going into doing a product and building a business plan, is like, can you actually tell a story that is worth listening to, and structure that narrative in order to make sure that this is something that flows, and something that not just flows to you, flows to others. The other value of that, which is kind of like memo writing and putting things down, is it forces you to kind of work through the idea. So something that sounds great to you, once you put it down on paper and really try to build a constructive narrative to kind of tell the beginning, middle, and end of what you're doing, when you read through that, you will start to see gaps. You will ask yourself questions as to like why this matters. And it really allows you to kind of flesh out ideas beyond just this single topic and single thing that you're looking to do. So that's kind of what I think about before a business plan. I think like that story needs to have a flow. It also needs to be fully fleshed out. And even though you feel it's very fleshed out in the way it is, it can always still go a bit further. So that's like one really strong trait that I would strongly encourage entrepreneurs to think about when they're kind of building these ideas, is really flesh it out, put it on paper, and make sure that it flows to you and flows to others, because then you have a better opportunity to maybe attract investors, if you could prove that out.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that really goes to what we were speaking about a moment ago, which is that you have to find a specific problem. You have to find then what your solution is. And as you say, ask why. And then it also forces your product roadmap. It forces you to lay out what specifically the milestones are and what you think you're going to get. And the ever important product market fit. Because that notion of, does the market need this? What is the market potential and where that's at? The other component, and maybe you can touch upon some of your experience about teams. And really in my experience, it has always been about finding the best team. I would say that, dare I say that, more often than not, they're investing in the team over and above the idea. And you can talk a little bit about your experience there, that mix of developers versus individuals that might be more business orientated. When you're starting off as a developer, how do you build that team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think really kind of recognizing your weaknesses is critical. And I think that that's a good thing. I think many that try to control too much don't just drown out the opportunity by, over managing, but they actually turn away people that could otherwise help elevate their company and feel like they're really a part of their company. So like one thing is really making sure that you hire people that are smarter than you in every element of your business. Like everywhere that I've worked, I don't want to say I was the dumbest person, because I don't believe that, but I think that I'm very, personally, I'm very comfortable knowing that there's people around me that are smarter than me in their areas of focus. And I think that that's a good thing. And I think that that's something that isn't just felt through the work that's produced, but through the conversations that are had externally, especially when it comes to investors or other teams that you're working with. But that's kind of a critical value of kind of what you're bringing, how you maintain that, how you build that culture, and how your team kind of thinks about you and represents you elsewhere. I also think giving opportunity for people within the group to kind of have their own voice, to be able to kind of work freely, not necessarily going completely out of control, but again, if you have experts and you have people who want to focus on certain things and they are experts in this area, what angles can you let them take in order to kind of expose that work and get it out there for the benefit of the brand? So that obviously could be tied back to the actual product that they're building and being able to allow them to kind of build this and put these things out there. That could also go to like how they're represented out in like social networks and in PR, and being able to have a point of view, because where things really start to come together is not only do you have a product and an idea that you're developing and looking to build a team around, but you should also be kind of hitting on certain values that are core to your company, but also values that are somewhat prevalent today. So when we launched Poet and we're building Poet, the big idea was that there was issues with rights. Individual creators were not able to kind of build and leverage and do things on their own, that it was all being taken by the platforms. There was concerns of fake news, right? So while Poet didn't solve for all of those things, there's certain ways that we could hit on key topics and trends that are important to society that we're also building solutions for. And I think that that's a way to attract the right people to your team that are, tied to your mission, that believe in your values. And again, going back to not just that being shown in the product that is built, but also with investors and the conversations that you're having, that'll help you build a very fluid and tight team that kind of is in it for the long haul. Because as you know, there are a lot of ups and downs and kind of ins and outs of this. So, being passionate about what you're building and being tied to that is, extremely important when you're looking to kind of build a new business, especially with new people bringing them to a team.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really, in my experience, it really does come down to those teams. I think the final piece maybe that I would add to that, specifically with investors, when perhaps you're putting together the pitch deck, I think as you know well, it really comes down to making it so that you can get the story and tell the story in 20 minutes, but also be able to expand upon it to 45 minutes. And there, you have to hit on these notes that we've spoken about, which is mission, problem, product market fit, solution, who the team is, and metrics for success too. In some instances, that is very specific. It could be user adoption, it could be developer adoption, it could be and any type of industry adoption or standard setting, whatever the case may be, and have that vision ultimately on how it will make money. That isn't to say that you need to be able to state what that revenue is now. You have to have a forward enough view as to how that eventually will make money. And then going through the size and the ask. So I think certainly if there's anything else you'd want to add.
No, I mean, it's actually, it's interesting that you brought that up, because I always think about that first, but because of how the conversation has gone, I didn't hit on it. But I think like it's very, like everyone wants to believe that like money and revenue, right, and the idea of like how to make profit is going to kill the dream. And not to say that that's not true, right? Revenue does kill the dream. But it's so important to think about that in the beginning, right? And as you kind of like hinted on, it's not the most exciting and it's not the most glamorous, but it's something that is critical to a business's success at any stage of growth. So really trying to understand what that value is and have those conversations early, and think about kind of the business plan of not just tied to like, this is how many users we think we could get, or this is how much market penetration we think we should get, but actually like this is something that people will see value in and see value in paying for is key, right? Like the biggest mistake is giving away your product for free in the beginning and then having to charge for it later to the same customers that had it for free in the first place. It's very hard to put a value on it. Even if it is extremely valuable, it's hard to then pinpoint and put it back. So really trying to think about that business plan and the value that it's bringing and making sure that it's something worth paying for is something that in the long run will help benefit your company.
That's awesome. I know we're coming up on our time. We wanted to make sure that we were pretty tight in this. So Jarrod, thank you so much for going through this with us, and look forward. I know that your bio and some of the information on how to reach out to you, I think will be in the link in connection to this.
Great.
Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike.